Arya had lived for more than 800 years, and in all that time she had never felt the kind of loneliness that now gripped her heart. She stood on the crystalline balcony of her mountain home, watching the three suns of Kepler Prime sink slowly toward the horizon. The alien landscape stretched endlessly before her, mountains of purple stone and valleys filled with bioluminescent plants that glowed like stolen stars. This was her world, the place she had chosen to call home after abandoning the ancient elf cities on the other side of the galaxy. She had come here to find peace, to escape the endless cycles of politics and war that had defined elf civilization for millennia. Instead, she had found something far more precious. She had found the dragons. Starfire emerged from the cave behind her, his massive form moving with surprising grace for a creature that weighed more than 100 tons. His scales were deep crimson, nearly black in the fading light, and they seemed to absorb the colors of the sunset and transform them into something entirely new. His eyes were ancient, far older than Arya's own, filled with the weight of centuries spent watching worlds change and civilizations rise and fall. When he settled his enormous head against the balcony, Arya reached out and touched the soft spot just below his eye ridge, a gesture that had become their greeting over the years. The connection between elf and dragon was deeper than mere friendship. It was something that had no name in any language Arya had ever learned. It was understanding without words, communication without sound, a bond that transcended the physical world and existed in some deeper realm of shared consciousness. Through Starfire, Arya could feel the concerns of the other dragons. She could sense their curiosity about the strange new creatures that had arrived from the stars just 3 weeks ago. She could understand their instinct to protect what they considered their world, even though they had allowed Arya to convince them to remain hidden for now. The humans were different from anything Arya had expected. She had studied their species before they arrived, scanning the ancient databases of elf knowledge about the younger races. She had known they were smart, adaptive, capable of remarkable creativity and cruelty in equal measure. But she had not anticipated how much she would like them individually, how their short lives would seem to burn with a kind of intensity that most immortal species had lost long ago. Helen, the colony commander, had proven to be especially fascinating. She was only 37 years old in human years, which made her little more than a child by elf standards, yet she possessed a wisdom that seemed to come from experience far beyond her years. When Arya had first revealed herself to the humans, walking down the mountain path with her hands open and empty, Helen had been the first to step forward without fear. She had welcomed Arya not as a curiosity or a threat, but as an intelligent being worthy of respect and consideration. During their conversations over the past 3 weeks, Helen had told Arya about Earth, about humanity's dream of expanding among the stars, about their hope that they might find allies in the vast darkness of space rather than only enemies. She had spoken about her daughter, a girl of 12 who was back on Earth waiting for her mother to return from this great adventure. She had talked about the pressures of leadership, about the constant fear of making the wrong decision and having that decision cost lives. Arya had listened to all of this and felt something stir in her chest that she had thought was long dead. She felt investment in another being's fate. She felt the desire to protect someone not because she owed them a debt or because it was her duty, but simply because she cared whether they lived or died. But now that feeling had transformed into something far more urgent and terrifying. 2 hours ago, Arya's monitoring systems had detected the first of the Zephyrian vessels entering the outer reaches of the system. By tomorrow morning, the warships would be close enough to scan the planet properly. By tomorrow evening, they would make their demands. By the following day, they would likely begin their assault if those demands were not met. The Zephyrians were beings of pure crystalline energy, creatures that existed as superimposed entities across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They did not eat, did not breathe, did not reproduce in any way that biological species could comprehend. They conquered worlds not for resources but for ideological reasons. They believed that all matter-based life forms were evolutionary dead ends, that the only true existence was energy-based consciousness. They had already destroyed 17 civilizations, and they showed no signs of slowing their expansion. Arya had fought the Zephyrians once before, centuries ago when they had threatened the outer colonies of the Elf Empire. She still bore the scars of that conflict, marks on her spirit that physical bodies could not display. She had learned that Zephyrian warships were nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, that their energy shields could withstand years of bombardment from standard military armaments. She had learned that they were ruthless, logical, and utterly indifferent to the suffering they caused. She had also learned that dragons were one of the few biological forces in the universe capable of standing against them. This was the secret she had guarded for so long, the reason she had come to this remote world in the first place. Dragons possessed the ability to manipulate energy in ways that could disrupt the Zephyrian existence. Their fire was not ordinary flame, but rather a focused manifestation of pure force, capable of tearing through dimensional barriers and striking at the very heart of crystalline consciousness. But dragons were rare, endangered, hunted to near extinction by civilizations that feared their power. Arya had spent 200 years searching for them, following ancient legends and fragmentary records, until she had finally found this world where a small population had survived unknown and unmolested. She had lived here with them for 50 years, learning their ways, building trust, becoming something more than an outsider but not quite one of them either. She had named them and they had accepted the names, though she understood that names meant something different to dragons. Each dragon's true name was a sound that contained their entire history, their personality, their place in the infinite tapestry of dragon existence. Arya could never fully pronounce these true names with her elf voice, but the dragons had accepted her simplified versions as terms of endearment, marks of their special relationship. Now she had to bring the truth she had been hiding directly to Helen and the humans. She had to tell them that the danger they faced was not just an ordinary invasion, that this would be a battle unlike anything their species had ever experienced. She had to ask them to trust not only her but also creatures they had never seen, beings that most human cultures considered to be nothing more than myths and legends. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Arya turned away from the sunset and moved back into the cave, her footsteps echoing against stone that had stood for millions of years. The other dragons were awake now, sensing her emotional state through their shared connection to the psychic web that bound all dragon consciousness together. Stormwing raised his head from where he had been resting, his scales of midnight blue seeming to draw in the last light of day and store it somewhere deep within his enormous frame. Ember and Ash, the twin dragons, moved in their familiar synchronized pattern, their movements mirroring each other so precisely that they seemed to be reflections of a single being rather than two separate creatures. They were younger than the others, only 400 years old, but they were no less powerful. Their scales shimmered between gold and crimson, colors that seemed to flow and change like liquid reflected in water. Little Whisper approached Arya with the curious enthusiasm of youth. She was the smallest of the dragons, barely the size of a large earth mammal called a whale, with scales that were still developing their final coloration. Sometimes they shimmered silver, sometimes pale green, sometimes a soft lavender that reminded Arya of storms in the elf highlands far from here. Whisper nudged Arya with her head, a gesture of affection and a question all at once. She knew something had changed in their world. She could feel the disturbance in the normal rhythms of their existence. Arya made her decision. She would go to Helen tonight. She would bring the colony commander back to this mountain, would introduce her to the dragons, would show the humans that they possessed an ally more powerful than they had ever dreamed possible, and together they would prepare for the coming conflict that would change everything. She moved toward the cave entrance, her elf senses already reaching out toward the human settlement far below. Somewhere in that cluster of lights and human technology, Helen was probably reviewing reports from their defense systems, probably trying to puzzle out why their long-range sensors had detected something unusual in the outer reaches of space. Soon, Arya would be there to provide the answers and to ask for humanity's greatest gift to give any other species, the gift of faith in the impossible. The walk down the mountain took Arya less than an hour, though she deliberately slowed her pace to match what would have been a reasonable speed for any observer. She wanted the human guards to see her coming from a distance, to have time to prepare rather than to be startled by her sudden appearance. The last thing she needed was for some nervous soldier to fire a weapon in panic before Helen could stop them. Humans were unpredictable in crisis situations, and their guns, though primitive compared to elf technology, could still cause injury to her if they struck the right places. The colony sprawled across the valley floor like a living organism, buildings of metal and composite materials arranged in a careful pattern that reflected both human engineering and the natural contours of the landscape. There were residential quarters where families slept, lab facilities where scientists studied the local ecosystems, agricultural domes where humans attempted to grow food from earth seeds, and at the center of it all, the command center where Helen conducted the business of leading 300 colonists in a place that was utterly foreign to their evolved experience. The guards at the perimeter checkpoint recognized Arya immediately. Over the past 3 weeks, she had become a familiar figure, though no less mysterious to them. She moved past them with a nod of acknowledgement, and within moments she had been escorted to the command center. Helen looked up from a display screen showing astronomical data, and her face registered surprise followed immediately by concern. Helen was taller than most human women, with the kind of physical presence that suggested she had trained for military service rather than administrative work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her eyes, sharp and analytical, studied Arya with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. She dismissed the other personnel from the room with a quiet gesture and waited until she and Arya were alone before speaking. Helen asked Arya if something was wrong, if there was some problem with the mountain colony or the local wildlife. Arya appreciated the question because it showed that Helen had been paying attention during their conversations, had understood that Arya's knowledge of this world extended far beyond what most outsiders would possess. Arya told Helen that they needed to talk privately, somewhere secure where they would not be disturbed or overheard. 20 minutes later, they were in Helen's personal quarters, a small but comfortable room that reflected the commander's personality. There were images on the walls, pictures of her daughter and her wife back on Earth, a framed photograph of a mountain landscape that Arya recognized as some place called Colorado. Helen had a cup of hot beverage that humans called tea, and she gestured to the chair across from her, waiting for Arya to explain why she had arrived at the command center with such urgency. Arya began by describing the Zephyrians. She talked about their history of conquest, their disdain for biological life forms, their absolute determination to convert or eliminate any civilization that refused to submit to their rule. She showed Helen star charts documenting the path of Zephyrian expansion, maps that clearly demonstrated how they were moving directly toward this sector of space. She explained that the sensors the humans had been using would be able to detect the first Zephyrian vessels within hours, and that Helen should expect to receive formal notice from her scouts soon. Helen listened without interrupting, occasionally taking small sips of her tea. When Arya finished, the commander leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she asked the question that Arya had been waiting for. Helen asked if there was something Arya was not telling her, if there was more to this warning than simple information sharing. Arya took a deep breath and told Helen the truth. She told her about the dragons, about why she had come to this world and why she had lived here for so long. She explained that the dragons possessed abilities that made them capable of fighting the Zephyrians, that they were one of the few biological species in the universe that could stand against crystalline consciousness. She described their power, their intelligence, their willingness to defend what they considered their home. Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the colony that she was responsible for protecting. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked Arya if she believed that the dragons could actually defeat the Zephyrians, if there was truly a possibility of victory. Arya told her the truth. She said that victory was possible but not certain. The Zephyrians were formidable opponents, equipped with technology and weapons that could devastate even dragon strength. But if humans and dragons fought together, if they combined their different abilities and perspectives, then they had a chance. It was not a guarantee, but it was far better than the alternative, which was complete annihilation. Helen turned back to face Arya, and the elf woman could see the weight of leadership pressing down on her. Helen had to think about 300 colonists, about their families back on Earth, about the reports she would have to file with the government back home. She had to consider whether trusting in the existence of legendary creatures was prudent leadership or dangerous desperation. She had to weigh the fears of her people against the promises of an elf woman who, though friendly, was still essentially an alien being. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Helen made her decision. She told Arya that she would need to see the dragons for herself, that her people would need concrete proof before they could be asked to trust their lives to beings they had only heard about in myths. She asked Arya if this was possible, If the elf woman could arrange for Helen to meet the dragons and speak with them directly, Arya felt relief wash over her. She had been prepared for Helen to reject her claims, to demand that Arya leave the colony and solve this problem on her own. Instead, Helen was choosing to meet fear with courage, to face the unknown with open-mindedness rather than closed-minded prejudice. This was the best response Arya could have hoped for. She told Helen that the dragons wanted to meet the humans too, that they had been curious about the newcomers from the stars ever since they had first arrived. She said that a small group, perhaps 5 or 6 humans, could ascend the mountain the following morning and see the dragons in their natural habitat. She warned Helen that the sight might be overwhelming, that dragons were far more impressive in person than any description could convey. Helen nodded slowly and said that she would prepare a group of her most trusted people, those who could handle the shock and fear and still maintain their composure. She asked Arya if the dragons were dangerous to humans, if bringing people there would put them in immediate physical danger. Arya assured her that the dragons would not harm any human without cause, that they were intelligent beings capable of restraint and judgment, not mindless beasts driven by instinct alone. As Arya was preparing to leave, Helen asked one more question. She asked Arya why she had stayed hidden for so long, why she had not simply told the humans about the dragons and dragons from the start. Arya explained that there were reasons of history and trust to consider, that many human cultures had a tendency to try to capture and exploit beings they perceived as powerful or valuable. She had needed to understand if the humans at this colony were different, if they were capable of seeing the dragons as allies rather than as resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. Helen smiled slightly and told Arya that she understood. She said that she was glad Arya had given them the chance to prove themselves worthy of trust. She promised that when they met the dragons, her people would treat them with the respect due to any intelligent being. As Arya left the command center and began her journey back up the mountain, she felt something that she had not experienced in many decades. She felt hope. She felt the possibility that humanity and dragons might find common ground, that together they could face the coming darkness and survive whatever the Zephyrians brought with them. It was a fragile hope, vulnerable to countless things that could still go wrong, but it was hope nonetheless. And for an elf woman who had lived 800 years, hope was perhaps the most precious commodity in the entire universe. The morning sun had barely crested the distant mountains when Helen and her team arrived at the base of the mountain path where Arya was waiting. The elf woman had chosen her companions carefully. There was Marcus, the colony's chief science officer, a man in his 50s with a gentle demeanor and insatiable curiosity about new species and ecosystems. There was Patricia, a younger scientist who had been fascinated by dragon legends since childhood, and had even written her doctoral dissertation on the cultural significance of dragons in ancient human mythology. There was Thomas, the head of colony security, a pragmatic military man who understood that humanity's survival might depend on the alliance they were about to forge. There was Susan, who served as the colony's physician and administrator, a woman whose calm presence had kept the community functioning smoothly during their first months on this alien world. And finally, there was Rebecca, Helen's second-in-command, who was being brought along as both a witness and a potential liaison between the dragons and human command structure. The climb up the mountain was difficult for the humans, and Arya deliberately slowed her pace to allow them time to rest. What would have been a casual walk for an elf took nearly 3 hours when adjusted for human physiology. As they climbed, Arya answered their questions about the dragons, about how long they had lived on this world, about how they had developed intelligence comparable to humans or elves, about what they ate and how they communicated. Patricia asked if dragons could be harmed, if they had any weaknesses that the Zephyrians might be able to exploit. Arya explained that dragons, like all living things, could be injured and killed. They were vulnerable to sustained energy attacks, especially attacks delivered in the places between their scales, where their biology was less protected. But dragons possessed regenerative abilities that far exceeded most species, and their natural armor was nearly impervious to conventional weapons. They were also incredibly fast and agile despite their massive size, capable of perceiving threats and responding to them with speed that often surprised adversaries. Thomas asked about their combat experience, whether the dragons had fought wars before, or if they would be entering into conflict without practical experience in organized warfare. Arya told him that dragons had defended themselves and their territories for millennia before she arrived, that they understood the nature of violence and the cost of conflict. She explained that dragons did not fight the way humans did not think in terms of military strategy and tactics. Instead, they acted on instinct and ancient knowledge, responding to threats with raw power and adaptive thinking that made them unpredictable and often devastating opponents. By the time they reached the cave entrance, all of the humans were breathing hard, their muscles aching from the exertion. Arya had prepared them for what they would see, had warned them that the dragons were enormous beyond typical human experience, that the sight of them might trigger fear responses despite their best intentions. She had told them not to be alarmed by the dragon's size or appearance, to remember that they were intelligent beings worthy of respect rather than monsters from nightmares, but no amount of warning could have fully prepared them for the reality of meeting the dragons. Starfire emerged first from the cave, and the humans instinctively stepped backward despite their training and their intellectual knowledge of what to expect. The dragon was simply too large, too overwhelming, too far beyond normal human scale. He was as tall as a 10-story building when he stretched to his full height, his wings capable of blotting out the sun when fully extended. His eyes were larger than human heads, filled with intelligence and an age that suggested he had watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than recorded human history could measure. When Starfire's voice resonated through the air, it was not sound in the normal sense but rather vibrations that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. Arya translated the dragon's words for the humans. Starfire was welcoming them, expressing curiosity about these new creatures that had arrived on their world, and acknowledging the danger that approached from beyond the stars. Then the other dragons emerged one by one. Stormwing's midnight blue scales seemed to absorb light, making him appear somehow darker and more mysterious than his red companion. Amber and Ash moved in their synchronized dance, their gold and crimson scales creating an almost hypnotic visual pattern. And finally, Little Whisper came bounding out with the enthusiasm of youth, her rapidly developing scales shimmering through a spectrum of colors. Patricia stepped forward before any of the other humans could react, approaching Little Whisper with an outstretched hand. Helen and Thomas both moved to stop her, but Arya placed a gentle hand on their shoulders. She told them to wait, to trust in what was about to happen. Whisper lowered her head, bringing her face down to Patricia's level. The young scientist touched the dragon's scaled forehead, and for a moment something profound seemed to occur. Patricia's expression shifted from fear to wonder, and when she turned back to the other humans, there were tears streaming down her face. She told them that she could feel Whisper's emotions, that there was a connection between them that transcended words or physical form. The other humans gradually approached the dragons, each taking time to observe and interact with them. Susan asked Starfire questions about dragon physiology, about whether they experienced pain and how their healing abilities actually functioned. Marcus wanted to understand their environment, how they survived on this world, what they ate, how they had evolved to possess the specific abilities they displayed. Thomas had a different focus. He asked about combat capabilities, about what kinds of attacks the dragons could deploy, about their tactical flexibility and their ability to coordinate with other fighters. Stormwing seemed to appreciate this pragmatic approach, and the dragon responded with a series of loud vocalizations that Arya explained were descriptions of their various combat techniques and offensive capabilities. Rebecca spent time with Ember and Ash, fascinated by their synchronized movements and the apparent mental connection between them. She asked whether they could be separated, whether they would maintain their coordination if split into different parts of a battlefield. Arya explained that the twin dragons were bonded in ways that went beyond normal dragon relationships, that they could communicate across any distance and would fight more effectively together than apart. As the morning progressed and the humans became more comfortable with the dragons, Arya explained the situation they faced. She provided data about the Zephyrian warships currently approaching their world, described their capabilities and their probable tactics. She explained that the dragons alone could not defeat them, that they would need human support and coordination to create an effective defense strategy. Helen asked Arya about the timeline. Arya confirmed that the first Zephyrian warships would be within weapon range by tomorrow evening, that they would likely establish communications at that time and make their demands. She said that they had perhaps 24 hours to prepare, to develop a coordinated plan, and to make the kind of military preparations that might give them a fighting chance against such a powerful enemy. Thomas asked directly if victory was truly possible. Arya looked at him and told him the truth. She said that they could win, that with the combined strength of dragons and humans they could drive back the Zephyrian invasion, but she also said that the cost would be high, that some of the dragons would likely be injured or killed, that some of the humans would probably not survive the conflict. Helen stepped forward and asked all the dragons together if they were willing to fight alongside humanity for the sake of defending this world that they had inhabited for so long. Starfire's response was immediate and affirmative. One by one, the other dragons voiced their commitment to the coming battle. Even little Whisper, despite her youth and relative inexperience, indicated her willingness to participate. Helen turned to her team and asked if they were ready to recommend to the Colony Council that they accept this alliance and begin preparations for war. Each human without hesitation agreed. What had seemed impossible just hours before now felt like the only logical course of action, the only way forward that offered any hope of survival. The news spread through the human colony like lightning through a storm, shocking and electrifying and transforming everything in its path. Dragons were real. Intelligent dragons lived on their mountain, and these dragons were willing to fight alongside humanity against an alien enemy that threatened to destroy them all. The Colony Council met in emergency session, and Helen presented the situation to them with clear logic and careful documentation. She showed them the astronomical data, the readings from their sensors, the calculations that demonstrated the approaching Zephyrian threat. She showed them recordings of the dragons, evidence that these creatures were intelligent and capable of communication. She explained the alliance that she had negotiated and the crucial role that the dragons would play in humanity's defense. Some council members expressed skepticism. How could they trust creatures they had only just learned about? What if the dragons betrayed them at the crucial moment? What if the whole situation was some kind of trap or deception? Helen listened to all of these concerns with patience, and then she asked them a simple question. She asked them what alternative they had. If the Zephyrians attacked and they refused this alliance, what would happen? The answer was obvious and undeniable. They would be destroyed. Their colony would be obliterated. Any humans who survived the initial assault would be captured and imprisoned or executed, depending on the Zephyrians' mood at the time. There was no escape, no way to negotiate with beings that viewed biological life as fundamentally inferior. The only choice humanity had was to stand and fight, and standing with the dragons gave them the only real chance of victory. The council voted unanimously to accept the alliance and begin military preparations immediately. The next 18 hours were a blur of activity and coordination. Thomas organized the human defenders into teams, assigning them to positions that would maximize their effectiveness in combat. He worked with Arya to understand the dragons' combat capabilities, trying to develop defensive formations that would allow humans and dragons to support each other, rather than interfering with each other's fighting. The humans trained with weapons that Arya provided from her personal armory, ancient elf weapons that far exceeded human technology in power and precision. The colony's scientists worked on understanding the nature of Zephyrian energy attacks, studying the data that Arya had gathered from previous encounters with their warships. They developed theories about how to defend against such attacks, about what kinds of barriers and shields might provide at least minimal protection. Patricia worked with Whisper, and the bond that had formed between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The young scientist began to understand dragon communication better, learning to interpret the emotional content and meaning behind the dragon's vocalizations. Susan prepared the colony's medical facilities for the incoming wounded, stockpiling bandages and medicine, preparing surgical equipment for the kind of injuries they might expect. She trained additional medical personnel in emergency trauma response, trying to ensure that if human colonists were injured in the coming conflict, they would receive care that might save their lives. The humans worked ceaselessly, driven by the knowledge that failure meant the end of everything they had built on this world. They worked past normal fatigue, sustained by adrenaline and the desire to survive. Some of them privately expressed doubt, whispering to each other about whether trusting the dragons was wisdom or foolishness, but none of them suggested abandoning the alliance. None of them proposed surrendering to the Zephyrians. All of them understood on some deep level that this was humanity's moment to prove itself, a test of whether they possessed the kind of character and resilience that would allow them to survive in a universe that was often hostile and dangerous. Arya worked alongside the humans, sharing her centuries of knowledge and experience with those who were willing to listen. She taught them about Zephyrian tactics, about the way the crystalline beings usually approached conquest. She explained that the Zephyrians typically sent a warning transmission before attacking, giving their victims time to surrender and avoid the coming destruction. She said that the transmission would be cold and logical, with no room for negotiation or compromise. Helen asked if there was any possibility of negotiating with the Zephyrians, of finding some common ground that would allow both species to coexist. Arya told her gently that such hopes were futile. The Zephyrians did not negotiate with biological life forms. They issued demands or they issued destruction orders, and there was nothing in between. The only response the humans and dragons could make was to prepare for battle. At one point during that long night of preparation, Helen sat with Arya on the mountainside overlooking the colony. The elf woman could see the physical and emotional exhaustion etched into the human commander's face. Helen asked Arya if she was afraid, if even with all her centuries of experience and power she felt fear when confronting the approach of war. Arya answered honestly. She said that fear was not something that went away with age or experience. She said that she had been afraid for 800 years, that she had learned to accept fear as a companion, rather than as something to be conquered. She said that the only way forward was to acknowledge the fear and act anyway, to do what needed to be done despite the terror of potential failure. Helen seemed to find comfort in this answer. She asked Arya why she cared so much about humanity, why she had chosen to help them when she could have simply prepared her dragons and fought alone. Arya was silent for a long moment before answering. She said that in 800 years she had learned that the greatest moments of her life came not when she was alone, but when she connected with other beings, when she shared purpose and struggle with others who understood what was at stake. She said that humanity possessed something that many older species had lost. They possessed passion and hope even in the face of impossible odds. They possessed the ability to be surprised by beauty and wonder. They possessed the capacity to care about beings they had just met, to take enormous risks for creatures they barely understood. These qualities, Arya said, were more valuable than any weapon or technology. She told Helen that by helping humanity survive, she was not just saving the colony. She was fighting for the preservation of everything that made biological life worth living, everything that distinguished the young races from the cold logic of the Zephyrians. As dawn broke over the mountains of Kepler Prime, the first Zephyrian warships became visible to human sensors. They formed a geometric pattern in space, clearly and deliberately arranged to demonstrate their organized power and their complete confidence in their superior capabilities. And then the transmission came. The Zephyrian message was exactly as Arya had predicted. It was cold, logical, and utterly indifferent to any concept of mercy or compromise. The beings of the crystalline collective informed the biological inhabitants of this world that they had until sunset to abandon the colony and submit to Zephyrian rule. If they refused, destruction would be initiated at local midnight, and all biological life on the planet would be exterminated. Helen listened to the transmission in the command center, surrounded by her people with Arya standing beside her. When the message finished and the communication systems went silent, Helen looked at the elf woman and nodded slowly. She issued a single command to Thomas. Helen told him to prepare the colony for battle. She told him that they would stand with the dragons and they would fight, no matter what came at them from the stars above. And in that moment, faced with an enemy of seemingly unlimited power, humanity made a choice that would define everything they would become. The final hours before the Zephyrian assault passed in a strange silence. The colony had been evacuated to the underground shelters, built into the natural cave systems that honeycombed the mountains. Thomas had positioned human defenders in strategic locations, equipped with the elf weapons that Arya had provided. But everyone understood that the real battle would not be fought on the ground. It would be fought in the skies above Kepler Prime. Arya stood with the dragons on the highest peak of the mountain range, looking up at the Zephyrian warships that now hung in low orbit above their world. She could see them with her enhanced vision, the geometric shapes of crystalline construction, the patterns of energy that played across their surfaces like electrical storms captured and contained. There were 7 warships in the Zephyrian fleet, each one capable of devastating an entire continent with concentrated energy attacks. But there were 5 dragons. Arya had placed her faith in those 5 creatures, and they had placed their faith in her and in the alliance she had forged with humanity. Starfire stood at the mountain's edge, his massive crimson form silhouetted against the violet sky. His wings were partially extended, ready to launch into full flight at a moment's notice. Stormwing paced back and forth, his midnight blue scales crackling with energy, his entire body seeming to hum with barely contained power. Ember and Ash stood together, their synchronized movement suggesting a mental connection that went deeper than words. And Little Whisper, despite her youth, stood with the same determined posture as her larger companions, ready to face whatever came. Arya had no weapons. Unlike the humans below who carried guns and explosive devices, Arya relied on the elf abilities that were written into her very cells. She could manipulate energy, channel forces that made standard physics seem like suggestions rather than laws. She could think fast enough to process information that appeared instantaneous to most species. She could feel the emotional and mental presence of the dragons around her, lending her their strength and receiving her guidance in return. At precisely 2 minutes before midnight, the first Zephyrian energy pulse descended from the heavens. It was not a slow beam or a directed attack, but rather a massive wave of energy that covered kilometers of territory. It was designed to overwhelm any defense through sheer power and volume. The human colony below would have been annihilated in seconds if not for the barrier that Arya erected, a shield of pure force that caught the Zephyrian attack and redirected it harmlessly into the mountains. The moment the barrier came up, the dragons moved. Starfire launched himself into the air with a speed that belied his massive size. His wings beat twice and he was already climbing higher, ascending toward the nearest Zephyrian warship. The dragon's roar echoed across the planet's surface, a sound that seemed to contain the raw power of 1,000 thunderstorms. Stormwing moved differently, his flight pattern erratic and unpredictable, making him a difficult target for the Zephyrian weapons. The midnight blue dragon was faster than Starfire, more agile, designed for combat rather than raw power. He moved in spirals and curves, avoiding the energy beams that the crystalline beings attempted to deploy against him. Ember and Ash moved as one, their attacks coordinated so perfectly that it seemed like they were fighting multiple Zephyrian vessels simultaneously. Their movements, their strikes, their defense and offense, all of it was synchronized in a way that created an almost hypnotic pattern of devastating effectiveness. Little Whisper stayed lower, her smaller size and relative weakness compensated by her speed and unpredictability. She darted between the energy attacks, her young scales somehow reflecting the crystalline beams rather than absorbing them, turning the Zephyrians' own weapons back against them in a way that seemed almost playful, despite the deadly seriousness of the situation. Arya coordinated with all of them, sending guidance through the psychic bond that connected elf and dragon. She guided their movements, helped them anticipate Zephyrian tactics, and provided moments of respite when the alien energy attacks came too close and threatened to overwhelm them. But the Zephyrians were not easy opponents. They had conquered 17 civilizations before reaching this world. They understood energy manipulation in ways that even elves had not fully grasped. Their warships redirected the dragonfire, absorbed the energy attacks, and launched their own counter-assaults with terrifying precision. The first injury came when a Zephyrian beam caught Stormwing on his left wing, scorching his scales and burning into the muscle beneath. The midnight blue dragon shrieked in pain but did not retreat. Instead, his attack became more ferocious, more desperate. The wound seemed to drive him forward rather than weakening his resolve. Patricia watched from the observation post that Thomas had set up in one of the upper caves, and she felt Whisper's pain through their bond. The young scientist understood then that the dragons were not simply fighting for strategy or territory or abstract concepts. They were fighting for their home, for their lives, for the lives of the humans who had somehow become their allies in a conflict that seemed to have no clear end. The humans played their crucial role in the battle, firing their weapons at the Zephyrian vessels that came within range. Their attacks were small and seemingly insignificant compared to the massive power that the dragons deployed, but they were not irrelevant. Each shot, each explosion, Each moment of distraction caused by human weapons allowed the dragons a fraction of a second to attack without interference. In a battle of this magnitude, such fractions of a second could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. For 3 hours, the battle raged. Dragons and Zephyrians clashed in the upper atmosphere of Kepler Prime, a conflict of such raw power and intensity that it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Energy attacks and dragonfire collided and merged and exploded in patterns that created their own weather system, a zone of electromagnetic chaos that spread across hundreds of kilometers. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance began to shift. The Zephyrian warships were not invulnerable. Dragonfire, when concentrated and coordinated, could damage even crystalline structures that were designed to withstand nearly any conventional attack. With each coordinated assault, the dragons inflicted more damage on the alien vessels. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, were learning that they had fundamentally misjudged the level of threat they faced on this world. What had seemed like a simple conquest of a primitive biological colony had transformed into a genuine war against enemies that possessed the power to actually hurt them, to damage their ships, to threaten their continued existence. By the time midnight arrived and the Zephyrian deadline passed, 3 of the 7 warships had been forced to withdraw from the direct combat zone. They were damaged but still capable of fighting. But their commanders apparently calculated that the cost of continued assault would exceed any benefit they might gain. The remaining 4 warships pressed the attack, becoming more desperate and more reckless as they realized that retreat might be their only option. But recklessness, when applied against enemies as capable as dragons, often led to catastrophic mistakes. It was Ember and Ash who delivered the turning point. In a coordinated maneuver that had clearly been planned through their telepathic bond, the twin dragons approached the largest remaining Zephyrian warship from opposite directions. Moving at such speeds that the crystalline beings could not track them properly, they struck simultaneously, driving their concentrated energy attacks into the vessel's core systems. The resulting explosion was visible from the surface, a brilliant flash of light that turned night into day for a brief moment. The largest Zephyrian warship simply ceased to exist, torn apart by the dragon's combined assault and its own failing internal systems. The remaining 3 warships made their decision almost immediately. They accelerated away from Kepler Prime, their damaged engines pushing them toward the wormhole that would carry them back to space that the Zephyrian collective controlled. They transmitted no messages, made no threats. They simply fled, leaving behind the wreckage of their failure and the clear knowledge that this world was not going to be easy prey. As the last Zephyrian ship disappeared from sensor range, a silence fell over Kepler Prime. The dragons descended slowly, their movements suggesting exhaustion and pain but also triumph and relief. Starfire's wing was partially torn, and Stormwing bore multiple wounds across his body, but all 5 dragons had survived the battle. All of them were returning to their home. Helen emerged from the underground shelters, leading the human colonists toward the mountains. They climbed toward the highest peak where Arya waited with the dragons. When Helen reached the elf woman, she placed her hand over her heart, a human gesture of respect and gratitude. Helen told Arya that they owed her a debt that could never be repaid. She said that humanity had been given a chance to survive, a chance to continue existing on this world because of the alliance that Arya had forged. She promised that humans would remember this moment, would pass the story down through generations, would ensure that the courage and strength of the dragons was never forgotten.